Hello everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. Some people think love means fighting for someone no matter what they do to you. I used to think that too, until the night I watched the woman I loved deliberately cross the one boundary I'd begged her to respect, thinking I'd chase after her and beg for forgiveness. She had no idea what would come next. My name is Vance. Everything began at my friend's house over 2 years ago. He was throwing one of his casual get-togethers and had invited 20 or 30 people and organized games to help everyone mingle. I'd been looking forward to it after a long week at work, mainly because this friend always managed to create a relaxed atmosphere where you could actually have real interaction with people. On this night, my friend had organized us into teams for various games he'd picked up. When it came time for the team-based activities, he randomly paired people up, and that's how I ended up sitting across from Regina. I noticed her earlier when I entered the party venue. She seems to be all right physically, but I thought nothing more about her. When Kevin announced our pairing for the first game, she smiled and introduced herself with a handshake. Our first interaction felt warm, and what struck me most was how easily we fell into conversation. Usually I needed time to warm up to new people, and I had assumed Regina would be like other girls I keep running into at parties like this that are full of self-inflated egos. But with Regina, it felt like talking to someone I'd known for years. She had a good sense of humor, similar perspectives on the games we were playing, and a natural back and forth that made the evening fly by. During the trivia portion, we discovered we both had an embarrassing amount of knowledge about 90s movies. When it came to charades, she was surprisingly good at reading my terrible acting attempts. By the time we moved on to the card games, we were finishing each other's thoughts and laughing at each other's limitations. The party wound down around 11, and as people started gathering their things to leave, Regina and I found ourselves still talking. I realized I didn't want the conversation to end. I suggested we exchange numbers, as I feel the rush of possibility one gets when you meet someone who matches you. As I walked to my car that night, I already knew I wanted to see her again. The texting started the next day. We picked up right where we'd left off at the party. We talked about our weekends, shared funny stories from work, and recommended movies and restaurants to each other. Within a short while, the texting had evolved into phone calls that stretched late into the evening. Regina had this way of making ordinary stories entertaining, and she was genuinely curious about my life. Most people ask how your day was out of politeness, but when Regina asked, she actually listened to the answer. After weeks of daily communication, we made plans to meet for coffee on a Saturday afternoon. That coffee date turned into lunch, which turned into walking around downtown for hours, which turned into dinner. By the time we said goodbye that evening, I was already looking forward to the next time I'd see her. The pattern continued for a couple of months. We'd text throughout the day, talk on the phone most evenings, and make time to see each other at least twice a week. Sometimes it was official dates. Other times it was more casual, like watching TV at one of our apartments and meeting up with friends at various social events. About 3 months into our friendship, I realized I needed to know where I stood. The connection between us felt romantic to me, but I learned not to assume someone else was feeling the same thing just because we enjoyed spending time together. During one of our evening phone calls, I asked directly if she was seeing anyone else or if she was looking for something serious. Regina's response was everything I'd hoped for. She wasn't dating anyone else, and she'd been wondering the same thing about my intentions. We'd both been feeling something deeper than friendship, but hadn't wanted to assume or push too fast. That conversation led to another date, this one specifically focused on figuring out what we wanted from each other. By the end of that afternoon, we'd agreed to start dating officially. I recall feeling excited, nervous, and hopeful all at once. Regina felt like someone special, someone who could become a real partner rather than just a casual relationship. The first 3 months of dating were everything you'd want from a new relationship. We were in that honeymoon phase where everything feels effortless and perfect, although we decided not to move in together yet. Regina was affectionate, thoughtful, and seemed as invested in building something meaningful as I was. We fell into comfortable routines. She'd come over after work some evenings, we'd spend most weekends together, and we started integrating each other into our separate friend groups. But during those early months, I began noticing something that made me slightly uncomfortable, though I tried to dismiss it as me being overly sensitive. Regina had many male friends, and they were very present in her daily life. When she would spend extended time with me, her phone would constantly be buzzing with texts from various guys, college friends, coworkers, neighbors, guys she'd met through hobbies and social activities. At first, I told myself this might be normal since some people naturally maintain friendships with the opposite sex when they are single, and I didn't want to be the kind of boyfriend who got jealous over innocent friendships. Regina was beautiful and outgoing, so of course, she'd have male friends who were after her friendship like I was some months before. But as the weeks went on, I noticed that she wasn't making any effort to create some sort of boundary with the amount of access these guy friends have to her, and that made everything increasingly uneasy. She'd get late-night texts that she'd respond to immediately, even when we were together. I noticed that she'd spend significant portions of her time texting back and forth with various people I would find out to be male friends. I had expected that as our relationship became more serious, she'd naturally create some boundaries around these friendships. Not cutting the guys off completely, but maybe establishing some limits that showed respect for our relationship. When someone is in a committed partnership, it's reasonable to expect that opposite-sex friendships will look different from they did when that person was single. But many months in, nothing had changed. I'd be talking to her about something important when we were spending time together, and she'd interrupt to respond to a text from one of her guy friends. We'd make plans for a quiet evening together, and phone calls might enter. I started questioning whether I was being reasonable or controlling. I'd never considered myself a jealous person, and I wanted to give Regina the benefit of the doubt. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that something about the dynamic wasn't quite right. I decided to bring it up during a weekend when Regina was staying at my apartment. We'd spent Saturday together and had settled in for a quiet evening at home. I needed to be honest about my concerns, even if it meant having an uncomfortable conversation. That evening, after we'd finished eating and were relaxing together, I told Regina I wanted to talk about something that had been on my mind. I started by sharing something I'd never told her about my previous relationship. 5 years earlier, I'd been with a woman I loved for about 8 months. She was smart, funny, and seemed completely committed to our relationship. She also had a close male friend whom she'd known since high school. My ex always insisted that the guy was just a friend, that they'd never been romantic, and that I had nothing to worry about. She'd get defensive whenever I expressed any concern about their friendship, accusing me of being insecure and controlling. She'd tell me that healthy relationships were built on trust, and that if I really loved her, I'd support her friendships instead of trying to limit them. For a while, I was the understanding boyfriend. When my ex would spend entire evenings texting with this guy while we were together, I wasn't firm in my speech that I did not allow this. The truth came out when I discovered they had something when I found a text between my ex-girlfriend and the guy she said was just a friend. The message was explicitly sexual, clearly part of an ongoing, intimate conversation between them. When I confronted her about it, she refused to admit anything, but I knew they'd been having an affair for 2 months. She'd accused me of being paranoid and controlling, even when she'd been lying to my face while carrying on a relationship with another man. The betrayal wasn't just about the physical affair. It was about the months of gaslighting, the way she'd made me feel crazy for trusting my instincts, the realization that someone I loved had been deliberately deceiving me while making me feel guilty for having normal concerns about appropriate boundaries. As I told Regina this story, I could see her really listening, taking in not just the facts, but the emotional impact it had on me. When I finished, I explained that this experience had left me with some sensitivities around opposite-sex friendships that I knew might seem unreasonable to someone who hadn't been through something similar. I told Regina that I wasn't asking her to cut off her male friends completely, but I did need some boundaries in place for me to feel secure in our relationship. Specifically, I asked that she not have male friends over to her apartment, that she avoid any behavior that could be seen as flirting or encouraging romantic interest, and that she maintain a respectful distance that acknowledged she was in a committed relationship. I braced myself for an argument. I expected Regina to push back, to tell me I was being controlling like my ex-girlfriend did, and accuse me of projecting my past trauma onto our relationship. Instead, she was quiet for a few moments, clearly thinking about what I'd shared with her. Finally, she said she understood why I'd have concerns given what I'd been through with my ex-girlfriend. She admitted that she'd never really thought about how her friendships might look from my perspective, and that she could see how some of her behavior might be disrespectful to our relationship, even if that wasn't her intention. Regina agreed to the boundaries I'd requested. She said she cared about me and wanted me to feel secure with her, and that maintaining some limits around her male friendships was a reasonable request from someone she was building a future with. I felt enormous relief and gratitude, not just because she'd agreed to my request, but because of how she'd handled the conversation. She'd listened to my concerns without getting defensive. She'd acknowledged the validity of my feelings, and she'd chosen to prioritize our relationship over maintaining total freedom in her friendships. Over the following months, Regina honored the boundaries we'd established. The constant texting with male friends decreased significantly. When we'd go out together, she'd focus her attention on me and our mutual friends rather than spending the evening absorbed in conversations with other men. The change made a huge difference in how secure I felt in our relationship. I stopped constantly wondering if I was competing for her attention or if she was keeping her options open with other men. I could relax and enjoy being with her without the underlying anxiety that had been building during those first few months. Our relationship deepened significantly over the next year. We talked about moving in together, about long-term goals, about the possibility of marriage. Regina met my family during the holidays, and I spent time with hers. We traveled together and made joint decisions about major purchases. By the time we'd been together for 2 years, I was confident that Regina was the woman I wanted to marry. We'd weathered the normal ups and downs that all couples face, and we'd consistently chosen to work through problems together rather than walking away when things got difficult. Like any long-term couple, we had occasional disagreements and arguments. Most were minor. We developed a pattern of talking through our differences, giving each other space when needed, and finding compromises that worked for both of us. The argument that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening. It was the kind of conflict that couples have when they're not communicating as well as they usually do. To me, it wasn't relationship ending, just two people who needed to work through a misunderstanding and reconnect. What made this argument different was the timing. We'd already committed to attending a party that weekend at our mutual friend's house. It was his birthday celebration, and we'd RSVP'd weeks earlier. Despite still being upset with each other, we agreed to go together rather than backing out or attending separately. The party was supposed to be a casual gathering of maybe 30 people from our extended social circle. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a fun evening. But from the moment we arrived, it was clear that Regina was still angry with me about our argument. She gave me minimal acknowledgement as we walked in together. We said hello to the host as a couple when we got through the door, but then she immediately moved away from me once we were inside. I understood she was upset, and I wasn't expecting her to pretend everything was perfect between us. But what happened next went far beyond giving me the cold shoulder. About an hour into the party, a guy, my girlfriend, Regina, known for years, who'd always been flirtatious with her despite knowing she was in a relationship. He was exactly the type of male friend I'd asked her to maintain boundaries with. Since our conversation about boundaries over a year earlier, this guy had kept his distance from Regina. I'd appreciated that she'd honored my request by limiting her contact with him and avoiding the kind of intimate friendship that had made me uncomfortable. But the moment he walked into this party, everything changed. Regina's entire demeanor shifted when she saw him. The cold, distant mood she'd been in all evening disappeared, replaced by an enthusiasm and warmth that had been completely absent when she was interacting with me. She practically bounced over to him, giving him an effusive hug and immediately diving into an animated conversation. I noticed how dramatically different Regina looked when she was talking to her guy friend. She positioned herself so that he had her complete attention. The contrast was impossible to ignore. All evening, she'd been treating me like I was invisible, but with Tyler, she was magnetic and engaging. I tried to focus on the conversations happening around me, But I couldn't help watching out of the corner of my eye the deliberate way she gave him the kind of focused attention she'd been withholding from me all evening. I told myself it was just a conversation. Regina was upset with me, and she was taking comfort in reconnecting with an old friend. It wasn't ideal, and it was definitely pushing against the boundaries we'd established. But people don't always make perfect decisions when they're angry. If she kept it to talking, I could live with it. But then the music got serious, and people started dancing. I watched this guy friend extend his hand to Regina, asking her to dance. For a split second, I thought she might decline, might remember where she was and who she was with. Instead, she took his hand with a smile that I hadn't seen directed at me all evening. They moved onto the dance floor, and I felt my stomach tighten. The dancing started innocently enough, the kind of casual, friendly dancing you'd expect at a party. But as the song progressed, things got more intense. Regina began moving closer to this guy friend, her body language becoming more intimate, more deliberate. She was dancing in a way that was clearly meant to be sensual. The music changed to something slower, more rhythmic, and that's when this guy friend's hands found her waist. I felt everything inside me go cold. This was exactly what I'd asked her not to do, exactly the kind of behavior that had destroyed my previous relationship. Regina knew this. She knew why I needed these boundaries, and knew that this specific kind of intimacy with other men was my one non-negotiable line. And she was crossing it deliberately, publicly, while making sure I could see every moment of it. The guy friend's hands settled on her hips as they swayed together, and Regina not only allowed it, but seemed to encourage it, moving closer to him, letting her hands rest on his shoulders, looking up at him with an expression of intimacy that belonged in private, not on a dance floor in front of our mutual friends. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, watching the woman I'd been planning to marry deliberately destroy the one boundary that mattered most to me. She wasn't drunk. She wasn't caught up in an innocent moment. This was calculated, intentional retaliation for our argument, and she was using my deepest vulnerability as the weapon. I didn't make a scene. I didn't storm over and demand an explanation. I didn't even tell anyone I was leaving. I simply turned around, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door. The drive home was silent. I didn't turn on music, didn't call anyone, didn't try to process what had just happened. I just drove through the empty streets, feeling strangely calm and certain about what I needed to do. I got home around 11:30 and went straight to bed. I didn't wait up for Regina, didn't wonder when she'd realize I was gone, didn't check my phone to see if she tried to contact me. I just went to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my front door. It was persistent, but not aggressive. I knew it was Regina without having to check. I lay in bed listening to her knock for about 5 minutes. Then I heard her voice calling my name, asking me to please open the door so we could talk. I got up, walked to the front door, and spoke through it without opening it. I told her I wasn't going to let her in and that she should go back to her place. She asked why I was being like this, what she'd done wrong, and why I wouldn't just talk to her like an adult. I didn't answer any of her questions. I just repeated that she needed to leave and go home. After about 30 more minutes of her trying to convince me to open the door, I heard her footsteps retreating down the hallway. I expected my phone to start buzzing immediately with texts and calls, but it didn't. Regina didn't try to contact me at all that night, and she didn't reach out the next day either. I found myself wondering if she was angry about how I'd handled the situation, if she thought I was being immature or overdramatic. I realized I didn't care what she thought. 2 full days after the party, my phone finally buzzed with a text from Regina. The message was casual, almost dismissive. "Are you done being angry so we can talk about this?" I read the text 3 times, struck by the assumption underlying her words. She thought I was having some kind of tantrum that would eventually pass, that this was a temporary, emotional reaction she just needed to wait out. I responded immediately. "There's nothing to talk about. Our relationship is over." Her reply came within seconds. "What? Vance, come on. Don't be ridiculous. I know you're upset, but we can work through this." I typed back, "I'm not upset. I'm done. We're done." What followed was a series of increasingly frantic texts, as Regina began to realize I was serious. She explained that she'd only danced with the guy to get back at me for our argument, that it didn't mean anything, and that she was sorry if I'd misunderstood her intentions. I responded one final time, "I understand perfectly, and it doesn't matter anymore." Then I blocked her number. Over the next several days, Regina tried various ways to reach me. She called from different numbers, sent emails, and even showed up at my workplace during lunch hour, hoping to catch me in the parking lot. When those attempts failed, she started recruiting our mutual friends to intercede on her behalf. I thanked them for caring enough to call, but I told them the relationship was over and my decision was final. They usually pushed a little when I say this, suggesting that everyone makes mistakes. I always explained that some mistakes reveal character in ways that can't be undone, and that this was one of those situations. The conversations were all similar. Regina had convinced them that I was overreacting to some minor incident at the party, and that I was throwing away a good relationship over nothing. I didn't go into detail about what had actually happened or why it was significant to me. I simply told each person that Regina and I were finished, that I appreciated their concern, but that my decision wasn't up for discussion. After about 2 weeks, the phone call stopped. I assumed Regina had finally accepted that I wasn't going to change my mind, or that our friends had gotten tired of being messengers in a situation they didn't fully understand. The months that followed were surprisingly peaceful. I'd expected to feel doubt about my decision, or loneliness, or regret about walking away from over 2 years of shared history. Instead, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't realized was there. I thought a lot about what had happened at the party and why it had been such a clear ending point for me. It wasn't just that Regina had crossed a boundary I'd explicitly asked her to respect. It was the deliberate, calculated way she'd done it, using my past trauma as ammunition in our argument. When someone shares their deepest vulnerability with you, when they trust you enough to explain their triggers and ask for specific support, you hold their emotional safety in your hands. What Regina did that night was take that trust and weaponize it, knowing exactly how much it would hurt me and not caring about the damage it would cause. Some people might say I should have fought for the relationship, should have given her a chance to explain and make amends. But fighting for someone implies they're worth fighting for, and what Regina showed me that night was that she wasn't someone who would protect my heart when her ego was bruised. Love isn't supposed to hurt you in your most vulnerable places. Partnership isn't supposed to feel like a constant negotiation about basic respect. The right person doesn't use your trauma against you when they're angry. I learned something important about myself during those months after the breakup. I'd rather be alone than be with someone who makes me feel unsafe in my own relationship. I'd rather walk away from years of history than accept treatment that damages my sense of self-worth. The right person, when you find them, doesn't need you to explain why certain behaviors are hurtful. They don't test your boundaries to see how much you'll tolerate. They don't use your past pain as a weapon when they're upset with you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to fight for someone who won't fight for your basic dignity. Sometimes walking away without looking back is the healthiest choice you can make.